May 19, 1536. Inside the formidable walls of the Tower of London, a scaffold is being erected. It's not for a common traitor or a petty criminal. It's for a Queen of England. She was the woman who had single-handedly changed the religion of an entire nation, the woman a king had obsessed over so intensely he was willing to defy the Pope himself just to have her at his side. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Only 3 years earlier, she had been crowned in a ceremony of unparalleled splendor, the symbol of a new age and a new dynasty. Now she was preparing for a very different kind of royal event, one that required a specialist and an imported French sword. So how did it come to this? How did one of the most intelligent and powerful women to ever wear the English crown end up on a scaffold just over 1,000 days into her reign, facing ludicrous accusations of adultery, with 5 men incest, with her own brother, and even witchcraft? How does a king's greatest obsession become his most disposable problem? It turns out that in the Game of Thrones, there's no such thing as happily ever after. There's only you're fired, and in the 16th century, the severance package was a whole lot sharper. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where royal marriages often end not with a settlement, but with a sword. To truly grasp the events of May 19, 1536, we first need to understand the stage where this final tragic act played out. Because this was no ordinary execution. It was a meticulously planned performance. Every detail from the location and the audience to the weapon itself was a deliberate choice, carefully curated to send a chilling, unambiguous message across the kingdom. This wasn't just about ending a life, it was about staging a narrative. So before our main character makes her final entrance, let's examine the set. The chosen venue was the Tower of London, and right away the irony is thick enough to choke on. The Tower wasn't just England's most infamous prison. It was also a royal palace. It was the traditional residence for monarchs in the days leading up to their coronation at Westminster Abbey. Anne Boleyn herself had stayed in these very same royal apartments, surrounded by splendor and anticipation, before she was crowned Queen of England. Now she was back in the same rooms, but the context had shifted from coronation to condemnation. It's a masterclass in psychological cruelty, forcing a person to live inside a museum of their own shattered dreams. Every tapestry she looked at, every window she gazed out of was a ghost of the power she once held. The stones themselves were saturated with the memory of her greatest triumph, now repurposed to witness her ultimate downfall. This duality is the essence of the Tower, a place you check into as royalty, with the very real risk of checking out as a criminal. How convenient! Its reputation as a place of grim endings was already legendary. The ghosts of the princes in the Tower, the 2 young boys who vanished within these walls decades earlier, still haunted its reputation. It was a place where powerful people disappeared. By choosing the Tower, Henry wasn't just executing his wife, he was placing her story within a long, dark tradition of royal tragedy and intrigue, forever associating her with treason and secrets. The execution itself was not performed on Tower Hill, the usual spot for public spectacles where the common folk of London could gather to gawk and jeer. Instead, a new scaffold was constructed inside the castle walls on a patch of ground known as Tower Green. This choice was critical. Henry wasn't selling tickets to the cheap seats. This was an exclusive A-list event. The audience was a carefully curated guest list of about 1,000 people. It was a who's who of the English elite prominent dukes like Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, who happened to be Henry's brother-in-law and a sworn enemy of Anne, and even Henry's own illegitimate son, the Duke of Richmond. And of course, the architect of Anne's downfall, Thomas Cromwell, was there to see his project through to completion. This wasn't an act of mercy to spare Anne the humiliation of a public crowd. It was a calculated act of political control. A public mob was unpredictable. They could be swayed by a moving speech. A wave of sympathy could lead to a riot. By limiting the audience to the political class, Henry ensured the narrative would be controlled. These attendees were not just spectators. They were witnesses tasked with observing the state-sanctioned execution of a queen, and then disseminating that story, the king's story, to the rest of the country. This wasn't a public execution. It was a corporate board meeting where a co-founder was being forcibly removed in front of the other executives. The message was crystal clear this could be you. And now we get to the props, which reveal the truly bizarre, almost obsessive level of production value Henry invested in this event. In England, the traditional tool for beheading a traitor was the axe. It was a brutal, terrifying instrument. It was about brute force, an executioner, often just a strong local man rather than a trained professional, would swing the heavy blade at the victim's neck as they lay their head on a wooden block. It was messy, it was visceral, and very often it took more than one swing. The axe was a butcher's tool designed to convey brutal, terrifying power. But Anne Boleyn would not be killed by an axe. In what Henry framed as an act of mercy, he decreed that she would be executed by a sword. This was the continental European method, the style of the French and Italian aristocracies. A beheading by sword required the victim to kneel upright, and the executioner, a true master of his craft, would slice the head off in a single, fluid motion. It was seen as more dignified, quicker, and less savage. There was just one small problem: nobody in England knew how to do it. So Henry VIII, King of England, did something truly extraordinary. He sent an urgent request to the English-controlled port of Calais in France, with instructions to find and hire the best swordsman executioner available. He was in effect outsourcing the job to a foreign specialist. Let's just pause to appreciate the sheer absurdity of this. At the very moment he was condemning his wife as the worst kind of traitor, a stain upon his nation, he was also deeply concerned with the aesthetic quality of her death. He splurged a significant sum, 23 pounds of fortune at the time, to ensure her beheading was performed with artisanal flair. While seizing church property left and right to fill his treasury, he still found the budget for a premium international contract termination service. It reveals a mindset so detached from normal human emotion, it's almost stunning. This wasn't a passionate act of rage, it was a cold, well-managed project. Finally, let's talk about the mood. With the stage set, the audience assembled, and the specialist waiting in the wings, the atmosphere on Tower Green that morning must have been unlike anything London had ever experienced. An English queen had never been publicly executed before. This was uncharted territory. The 1,000 or so witnesses stood in a heavy, tense silence. This wasn't the drunken roar of a common execution. This was the morbid, electric stillness of a courtroom right before the verdict is read. Except the verdict was already known and the sentence was about to be carried out in front of them. It was a potent cocktail of grim satisfaction from Anne's enemies, unspoken fear from those who understood the political precedent being set, and morbid curiosity from everyone. They were about to witness an act that would define the reign of their king and be talked about for centuries. They were watching history in all its brutality. The scaffold was ready. The audience was in place. The French swordsman had practiced his swing. All that was left was for the main character to walk from her palace prison and play her final part. So we have our grim stage set with an almost theatrical precision. We have our hand-picked audience of the powerful and the privileged. We even have our imported specialist waiting with his finely sharpened sword. But this entire production is missing its leading lady. How exactly did Anne Boleyn get cast in this terrible play to understand that we need to rewind the clock about a decade? We need to go back to a time when Anne wasn't a prisoner, but the prize. A time when her execution was unthinkable because she was the single most powerful obsession in the king's life. This is the story of a high-stakes corporate takeover that became the most brutal divorce in history. Our story begins with King Henry VIII facing a crisis. Let's call it his great matter. He was married to the formidable and pious Catherine of Aragon. They had been married for nearly 2 decades. She was a respected queen, the daughter of Spanish royalty, and she had given him a child, Mary. But she had failed repeatedly to deliver on the one key performance indicator that mattered to a 16th century king, a male heir. Without a son, the future of his entire dynasty, the House of Tudor, was in jeopardy. Henry was getting older, more desperate, and increasingly convinced that his lack of a son was a sign of God's judgment upon him for marrying his brother's widow. Into this tense, anxious court steps Anne Boleyn recently returned from the sophisticated courts of France. She wasn't like the other English ladies. She was witty, stylish, sharp-tongued, and carried herself with an air of continental confidence that Henry found absolutely intoxicating. He wanted her, and like any king used to getting exactly what he wanted, he assumed she would become his mistress. And this is where Anne made her first and greatest power play. She said no. In a world where becoming the king's mistress was a career move, a fast track to wealth and influence for one's family, Anne refused the temporary contract. She wasn't interested in being a side project. She was demanding a full partnership with equity. She wanted the crown. This wasn't just romantic coyness, it was a brilliant high-stakes gambit. By making herself the one thing he couldn't have, she became the only thing he wanted. What followed was a 7-year-long siege. It was less a courtship and more of an obsessive, all-consuming political and romantic negotiation. We still have the passionate, almost desperate love letters Henry wrote to her. He was a king brought to his knees metaphorically by a woman who understood her own value. The stalemate was absolute. Henry wanted a son, which required a new wife. Anne was willing to be that new wife, but he was still married. To close the deal, Henry had to do something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. He had to fire the Pope. When the Vatican refused to grant him an annulment from Catherine, Henry, guided by radical thinkers and his own ambition, decided to simply break away from the authority of Rome itself. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, divorced Catherine, and finally, in 1533, he married a pregnant Anne Boleyn. It was the most extreme its complicated relationship status update in history, and it permanently altered the course of a nation. Anne had won. She had played the game for the highest stakes imaginable and emerged with the ultimate prize. Her coronation was a spectacle of triumph. She was Queen of England. The past was erased, the future was hers. All she had to do now was deliver on her one crucial promise. A few months later, she gave birth. The anticipation was feverish. Astrologers had predicted a prince. The kingdom held its breath, and it was a girl. A healthy, red-headed baby girl named Elizabeth. For Henry, this was a devastating blow. He had overturned the religious order of a millennium-risked war with Catholic Europe and alienated half his kingdom for another daughter. You can almost hear the divine customer service line telling him, "We're sorry your order could not be delivered as specified." He put on a brave face, saying a son would surely follow, but the first crack in the foundation had appeared. Anne's time as queen was turbulent. She was not a quiet, submissive consort like Catherine. She was an active political player with strong opinions on religious reform. Her sharp intellect and even sharper tongue earned her powerful enemies at court, who saw her as an arrogant upstart. The public, many of whom were still loyal to the beloved Catherine, called her the king's great whore. The pressure on her to produce a son was now immense, not just for the dynasty, but for her own survival. What followed was a series of personal and political tragedies. She had at least 2 miscarriages. The final one in January 1536 was the tipping point. It was a male fetus. For a king as superstitious as Henry, this was the ultimate sign. God was not blessing this union. His obsession, which had burned so brightly for years, was now rapidly curdling into a dark and bitter resentment. He began to believe the whispers of her enemies that perhaps he had been seduced into this marriage by witchcraft. The woman he had seen as the solution to all his problems was now the source of all his failures. The startup he had invested everything in had failed to launch, and the lead investor was looking for an exit strategy. As Henry's affection for Anne died, his eyes began to wander, and they landed on Jane Seymour. Jane was one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, and she was everything Anne was not: meek, gentle, quiet, and submissive. She was the safe, user-friendly interface after the complex and demanding Anne OS. Henry was enchanted, but he was trapped. He couldn't divorce another wife. It would make him look like a fool and a tyrant to the world. Annulment was also a problem, as it would once again make his child, this time Elizabeth, illegitimate. He needed a cleaner, faster, more permanent solution. Enter his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the ultimate political fixer. Cromwell saw the king's dilemma, and he also saw an opportunity to remove his political rival Anne and secure his own position. He promised the king a solution, and he delivered with chilling speed and efficiency. In late April 1536, the dominoes began to fall. A court musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested. Under what was almost certainly torture, he confessed to having an affair with the Queen. His confession was the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Based on his testimony, several other high-profile gentlemen of the court were arrested, including Sir Henry Norris and, most shockingly, the Queen's own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were a masterclass in character assassination. Anne was accused of adultery with all 5 men. She was accused of incest with her brother. She was accused of plotting the king's death. And hints of witchcraft were woven throughout. It was a fabricated narrative designed to paint her not just as an unfaithful wife, but as a sexually insatiable monster who threatened the very stability of the realm. When you're manufacturing a case from scratch, you might as well go for the premium model. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, entering through the infamous Traitor's Gate. She was stunned, disbelieving. The trials that followed were a complete farce. The evidence was flimsy, based on coerced confessions and hearsay. But the verdicts were a foregone conclusion. The accused men were found guilty and sentenced to death. Then it was Anne's turn. She stood before a jury of her peers led by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and defended herself with intelligence and dignity. It didn't matter. She was found guilty on all counts. Her sentence was to be burned at the stake or beheaded at the king's pleasure. The story had now come full circle. The narrative of her rise and fall was complete. The king had his solution, and the stage, which we have already examined, was now set for her final appearance. So that's the story the Tudor court wanted you to believe. A swift, dramatic downfall of a treacherous queen brought to justice by a righteous king. It's a neat, tidy narrative where good triumphs over evil and the stability of the kingdom is secured. It's also most likely a complete and utter work of fiction. Here in the chamber, we don't take official stories at face value, especially when they are this convenient. The charges against Anne Boleyn are so shocking, so numerous, and so perfectly tailored to result in her destruction that they beg for closer inspection. Was she really the monstrous adulteress the court records claim her to be, or was this the most sophisticated and brutal frame-up job in English history? It's time to open the case file on the divorce of the century. Let's first lay out the case presented by the prosecution, led by the king's master fixer, Thomas Cromwell. According to them, Queen Anne Boleyn was not the pious reformer she appeared to be. She was a woman of insatiable carnal appetites. Over the course of her reign, she had allegedly engaged in adulterous affairs with no fewer than 5 men. These weren't just commoners. They were high-ranking gentlemen of the king's own privy chambermen who had his ear and his trust. The list included a court musician, a groom of the stool, and even her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. The charge of incest was the venomous masterstroke designed to paint her as not just unfaithful, but as someone unnaturally depraved. And to top it all off, they claimed that she and her lovers had conspired to bring about the death of the king himself. This narrative transformed her from a disappointing wife into a mortal threat to the crown. It was treason of the highest order, and it carried only one sentence. This was the story Henry VIII needed the world to believe. Now let's see if it holds up to scrutiny. Exhibit A, the impossible timetable. The first thing any detective does is check the alibis. And when modern historians did just that with the charges against Anne, the entire case for the prosecution begins to look like a logistical fantasy. The indictments against Anne were incredibly specific, listing the dates and locations of her alleged affairs. The problem is, these specifics are what unravel the whole story. For example, one charge claimed she had an illicit encounter with Sir Henry Norris at the Palace of Westminster on a certain date. But court records and other documents clearly show that on that very day, Anne was at Greenwich Palace, miles down the river. It's a solid alibi written into the historical record. Many of the other charges fall apart under similar scrutiny. But more important than specific dates is the general reality of a Tudor queen's life. A queen in the 16th century was never ever alone. She was a public institution, a symbol of the nation, and her life was a constant performance. From the moment she woke to the moment she went to sleep, she was surrounded by a swarm of ladies in waiting. They dressed her, they bathed her, they ate with her, They even slept in her bedchamber. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist. The idea of her successfully orchestrating 5 separate long-term affairs under these conditions of constant surveillance isn't just improbable, it's absurd. It would be like trying to run a secret international spy ring from inside a glass box in the middle of Times Square. Someone would have noticed. Someone would have talked. Yet no credible eyewitness testimony from her army of attendants was ever produced. The entire case was built on something far flimsier. Exhibit B, the confession under duress. The entire investigation, the domino that toppled the whole set, rested on the confession of one man, a court musician named Mark Smeaton. He was the first to be arrested, and he was the only one who confessed to having an affair with the Queen. So why did he confess? The answer is grimly simple. Smeaton was a commoner. The other 4 accused men, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn, were all aristocrats. According to English law at the time, it was illegal to torture a nobleman. A commoner like Mark Smeaton, however, had no such protections. Historical sources are clear that Smeaton was kept in irons at Thomas Cromwell's house and was grievously racked, a polite way of saying he was tortured until he broke. A man facing unbearable physical pain will say anything his tormentors want to hear. His confession extracted under duress is completely worthless as evidence. What's even more telling is what the other men did. All 4 aristocrats who could not be legally tortured maintained their innocence and the Queen's innocence from the moment of their arrest to the moment the axe fell on their necks. On the scaffold, Henry Norris made a carefully worded speech stating he deserved to die if he were guilty, a classic non-confession. George Boleyn passionately declared his innocence. Even Mark Smeaton, the source of it all, seemed to recant, on the scaffold saying only that, "In my death I bid you all farewell." He never repeated his confession in public. The entire case was built on the words of one man likely screaming in agony in a private room. Exhibit C, the motive, a royal reset button. If the evidence was fabricated and the confession was coerced, then we have to ask the real question: why was this case manufactured? The answer has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with solving the king's very inconvenient marital problem. By early 1536, Henry was done with Anne. She was opinionated, intelligent, and argumentative. She had failed to give him a son, and most importantly, his eye had wandered to the quiet, submissive Jane Seymour. He desperately wanted to marry Jane, but he was stuck. He couldn't go crawling back to the Pope to get a divorce from Anne after he had literally split the country in 2 to get rid of his last wife. It would be a global humiliation. He could try for another annulment, but that would mean admitting his marriage to Anne was never valid, which would make their daughter Elizabeth illegitimate, a political headache he didn't need. He needed a third option, a reset button that would eliminate Anne quickly finally, and in a way that made her the villain, not him. Execution for treason was the perfect, brutal solution. It was final. It legally erased her from the picture, freeing him to marry Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's head fell. It conveniently disposed of a wife he no longer wanted and created a powerful piece of propaganda, recasting his own failure to produce an heir as the fault of a monstrous, treacherous woman. It wasn't a matter of justice, it was a matter of ruthless, pragmatic housekeeping. Anne Boleyn was no longer an asset, she was a liability on the royal balance sheet, and Henry was downsizing. So we assemble the pieces: an impossible timeline, a confession extracted by torture, a king desperate for a new wife and a male heir, a political fixer willing to do anything to please him. The picture becomes terrifyingly clear. Anne Boleyn was the victim of a meticulously planned judicial murder. The real curse that brought her down wasn't witchcraft or adultery. The cursed chamber she inhabited was the conditional nature of her power. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who had the institutional power of the Catholic Church, and the backing of her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Anne's power was derived from a single, volatile source, King Henry VIII's personal desire. Her intelligence and ambition allowed her to capture that desire and ride it to the very pinnacle of power. but it was a foundation built on the shifting sands of one man's infatuation. When that infatuation faded and curdled into disappointment, she had nothing to fall back on. Her power was a loan, not a possession, and the king had decided to call it in. The moment she ceased to be the object of his obsession and the potential mother of his son, she became something else entirely, an obstacle. And in the brutal court of Henry VIII, obstacles were not navigated. They were removed. And so the deed was done. The sword fell, the cannon fired, and the 1,000-day queen was no more. In the immediate chilling aftermath, the calculated cruelty of the affair was laid bare. No coffin had been prepared for the former Queen of England. Her ladies-in-waiting, with horrified courage, wrapped her head and body in white cloth and placed them into the only container that could be found, a crude, empty arrow chest from the Tower's armory. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a traitor's end for a woman who had once been the most celebrated in the kingdom. The verdict of this chamber is therefore unequivocal. Anne Boleyn was not guilty of the fantastical crimes for which she was executed. The case against her was a sham built on a foundation of coerced testimony, logistical impossibilities, and political convenience. She was the victim of a state-sanctioned judicial murder, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell and authorized by her own husband, King Henry VIII. It was not an act of justice. It was an act of disposal, a brutal, efficient solution to a personal and political problem. She was in the end a bug in the code of Henry's ambition, and he had decided to simply delete her. But when you delete a queen who changed the world, the story doesn't end when her heart stops beating. The echoes of that single sword stroke would reverberate for centuries. The first, most immediate ripple was the sound of wedding bells. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. He didn't observe a respectable mourning period. He observed a get the new wife installed as quickly as possible period. To him, the problem was solved. And for a brief shining moment, it seemed he was right. Jane gave him what Anne never could, a son, the future King Edward VI. Henry finally had his male heir. His ruthless gamble had apparently paid off. But the victory was hollow and fleeting. Jane Seymour died from complications of childbirth just 12 days after her triumph, and Henry's longed-for son Edward would grow into a sickly boy who reigned for only 6 years before dying, throwing the kingdom right back into the succession crisis Henry had tried so desperately to avoid. After Anne, Henry would go on to marry 3 more times, a chaotic carousel of divorce and death that proved one thing: Anne was never the real problem. The problem was Henry himself. But the larger ripple effect of Anne's life went far beyond the king's bedchamber. The English Reformation, the monumental religious break with Rome that she had championed and symbolized, could not be undone. The political and economic machine that Henry had set in motion by dissolving the monasteries had a momentum all its own. A new class of Protestant-leaning nobles had become rich and powerful from the spoils of the old church. England was now on a fundamentally different path, a path Anne had helped carve. Her death didn't reverse the journey. It only martyred one of its chief architects. The chaos she left behind would define the next 2 decades. After Edward's brief reign, the throne passed to Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary the Reuss. A devout Catholic, Mary spent her own bloody reign trying to drag England back to Rome, burning hundreds of Protestants at the stake and earning the nickname Bloody Mary. Her entire reign can be seen as a violent, tragic reaction against the legacy of her father's marriage to Anne Boleyn, the woman who had displaced her mother and declared her a bastard. The instability and violence that racked England during this time was the direct, chaotic inheritance of Henry's quest to have Anne and the subsequent fallout. But all of these ripples are dwarfed by the final tidal wave of her legacy, the one she left behind in the form of a little red-headed girl. The ultimate staggering irony of this entire story is Elizabeth. Henry VIII tore his kingdom apart, defied the Pope, and judicially murdered his wife, all in the obsessive pursuit of a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. He saw the birth of Elizabeth as a bitter disappointment, a cosmic failure. He had her declared illegitimate and cast her aside. Yet it was this rejected daughter who would inherit the throne after the chaotic reigns of her half-siblings. And she would not just rule, she would triumph. Elizabeth I reigned for 44 years, an era of such cultural and political flourishing that it bears her name, the Elizabethan Age. She inherited a fractured, bankrupt nation on the verge of civil war and transformed it into a stable, prosperous world power that defeated the Spanish Armada. And the ghost of her mother was present in every decision she made. She learned the brutal lessons of her mother's life and death. She saw how Anne's power, built entirely on the foundation of a man's love, was ultimately fatal. And so Elizabeth made a revolutionary choice. She refused to marry. She played the courts of Europe against each other, using her eligibility as a political tool, but she never surrendered her authority to a husband. She presented herself as the Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom. It was a brilliant political strategy born from an intimate personal trauma. She saw the trap that had ensnared her mother, and she vowed never to fall into it. And so we are left with one of history's most profound and satisfying ironies. Henry VIII moved heaven and earth for a son, and in the end it was Anne's daughter who saved the dynasty. It's a cosmic joke of such epic proportions you can almost hear the universe laughing at the vanity of a king's ambitions. Anne Boleyn's story is a powerful, brutal lesson. It's a story about the intersection of love, ambition, and power. It shows how a woman of incredible intelligence and will could rise to the highest peak only to be destroyed when her utility to the man in charge had expired. She has been caricatured for centuries, the scheming seductress, the six-fingered witch, but the reality is far more compelling. She was a modern woman in a medieval world, a political player in a game designed by men for men. She lost that game in the most horrific way imaginable. Her end was one of terror, injustice, and indignity. But history has a long memory. The verdict of her time was guilty. The verdict of history is framed. And her ultimate vindication came in the form of the glorious reign of the daughter she died to protect. Anne Boleyn, the thousand-day queen, lost her head, but her bloodline won the century. What do you think is Anne's true legacy? Let us know your verdict in the comments. And if you want to unlock more of history's cursed chambers, be sure to subscribe. The past is waiting.